30 Myths of Great Civilizations, Rome, Egypt, Maya. Ancient Rome, the land of the pharaohs and the mysterious Maya civilization. 3 worlds, 3 eras, and 30 myths that crumble to dust at the slightest touch of reality. If you're ready to uncover the truth behind the myths of these great civilizations, which have been believed for centuries, support this series with a like and share in the comments which revelation shocked you the most. This will inspire us to explore new archives. Myth number 1. Ancient Rome, the great lie about Nero and the fire. Picture this scene, painted by generations of historians, writers, and filmmakers. A mad tyrant standing on the tower of his palace, cradling a lyre under his chin, fingers gliding over the strings while below him, the great city is ablaze. Rome is on fire. The people are screaming, and the emperor? He plays. This image is so deeply embedded in our cultural consciousness that the phrase "Nero fiddled while Rome burned" has long become a proverb used for any leader who is inactive during a crisis. For centuries, this was repeated by teachers, penned in books, and no one dared question it because the image was too alluring, too perfectly fitting for the mad tyrant whom Rome both feared and despised. The fire broke out in July of 64 AD. It started in the shops by the Great Circus, where wooden stalls were packed closely together, where flammable oil for lamps was stored in tight corners, and where a single spark could turn the neighborhood into a torch. The fire raged for 9 days, devastating 10 out of 14 districts of Rome. It was a disaster the city hadn't seen since the Gallic invasion. However, what was conveniently omitted by those who delighted in telling the tale of the lyre and the mad emperor is that at the moment the fire ignited, Nero was in Antium, a coastal city about 50 kilometers from Rome. This is no speculation, no assumption. It is clearly documented by Tacitus, a historian who, mind you, was not a fan of Nero and pointed out his vices at every opportunity. Tacitus writes plainly, "Upon learning of the fire, Nero immediately returned to the city, and he didn't return merely to observe. He organized a massive rescue operation. He opened his own gardens on the field of Mars for homeless citizens. He ordered grain to be shipped from Ostia and its price reduced so that the people wouldn't starve in the chaos of the post-fire days. He personally visited the ruins to assess the damage. So where does the lyre come in? Here the story takes an unexpected turn. Some ancient sources, primarily Suetonius, who wrote decades after Nero's death and was clearly not inclined toward objectivity, mention that the emperor supposedly sang while looking at the flames. But this was not about a lyre in the classic sense, nor was it a mad revelry. One version of the tale suggests that Nero performed his own piece about the fall of Troy, perhaps when the fire was just beginning to blaze and he was still in Antium. This could have been a poetic response to the news, rather than a dance over the ashes of his own people. As for the accusations of arson, they existed, and Nero indeed shifted the blame onto the Christians, launching one of the first large-scale persecutions of that community. This is a dark and real fact. However, the image of the laughing tyrant, holding a musical instrument while indifferently watching a million-person city burn, is a later construction, shaped by political hatred, literary exaggeration, and our own fascination with vivid villains. The truth is far more complex and, if you will, much scarier. Nero was a man with deep psychological contradictions, capable of both cruelty and unexpected generosity. Yet, this simplistic portrayal, a tyrant with a lyre, has proven more enduring than any nuanced truth. The myth of burning Rome and the playing Nero has lasted for nearly 2,000 years. It outlived its creator and even the Roman Empire itself. It became a metaphor, ingrained in the languages of nations that have never heard of any Nero. This is what a well-crafted lie can do. It becomes a language. And to unravel it, one must be ready to part not only with the fact, but with the beautiful image that warmed the soul with its clarity. If you think this is the only myth that Rome has gifted us, brace yourself. The next story concerns the very foundation of the Eternal City, and a child who, according to legend, was nursed by a she-wolf. Myth number 2. Ancient Rome, the she-wolf that never existed. She stands in museums. She is cast in bronze. She adorns coats of arms, emblems, and logos. The she-wolf nursing the two infants, Romulus and Remus, is perhaps the most recognizable symbol of Rome, second only to the Colosseum. Legend has it that the abandoned children were found and nursed with her milk by a wild she-wolf, and later discovered by a shepherd named Faustulus. From these children grew the founder of Rome. From this she-wolf evolved the idea of the city's eternal, unbreakable, almost primal spirit. For centuries, no one questioned this story, at least as a metaphor. It perfectly explained why Rome is what it is: tough, predatory, unstoppable. But there's a small detail that's often overlooked when telling this story. In Latin, the word lupa meant both she-wolf and prostitute. It was a slang term, lively and commonly used. Brothels in Rome were called lupanaria, literally wolf dens. When historians began digging into the earliest versions of the tale of Romulus and Remus, an interesting detail emerged. In some older variations of the story, the woman who found and nursed the children was not a wild animal, but rather a lupa, a woman of easy virtue. According to one version of the legend, preserved by several ancient authors, the wife of the shepherd Faustulus, Acca Laurentia, was known locally by that very nickname. She was the one who took in the foundlings. The animal was introduced later as a more noble, mythically majestic substitute for the uncomfortable truth about the founders of the great empire being nursed by a prostitute. This doesn't mean that the legend of Romulus and Remus is entirely fabricated. This means that somewhere around the dawn of Roman history, someone decided to replace the narrative of a human with a beast, because a beast sounds better. The she-wolf symbolizes wild strength, a spirit of nature, and a fate that's chosen. Meanwhile, the phrase, "the prostitute bore abandoned children," tells a tale of human kindness, but it's not quite suitable for the propaganda of a world empire. The famous bronze she-wolf, which can be seen today in the Capitoline museums and was long believed to be an Etruscan work from the 5th century BCE, adds another layer to this story. Research conducted in the early 2000s using radiocarbon dating revealed the sculpture was cast not in antiquity, but around the 11th to 12th centuries CE. Medieval craftsmen created an ancient symbol of Rome, and for centuries, everyone believed they were gazing at an authentic relic from the era of the founders. A double deception. First, an animal replaced a human in the legend, then a medieval statue replaced a non-existent ancient original. Rome built its myth about itself layer by layer, with each layer being slightly more beautiful and slightly less truthful than the one before. But let's set Rome aside for a moment. Because along the banks of the Nile, a story unfolded where myth and reality intertwined so tightly that even today researchers debate where one ends and the other begins. Myth number 3. Ancient Egypt. Cleopatra was Egyptian. Say her name, and the imagination immediately conjures an olive-skinned beauty with kohl-lined eyes, adorned in gold jewelry, a cobra resting on her crown. Cleopatra is the quintessence of Egypt, mysterious, Eastern, exotic. Her image is so inseparable from that of the country that it seems sacrilegious to even ask. But it's necessary to ask, was Cleopatra actually Egyptian? The answer, which shatters all of the above, is no. At least, not in the sense we typically understand it. Cleopatra VII, the queen who was the lover of Caesar and Antony, belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy I was a Macedonian general of Alexander the Great, Greek by blood and Greek in culture and language. After Alexander's death, he seized Egypt and founded a dynasty that ruled the country for almost 300 years. Throughout this time, the Ptolemies maintained Greek as the language of the court and administration. They primarily married relatives, as well as other Greek or Macedonian aristocrats. Many of them never learned the Egyptian language. Cleopatra VII, well documented by ancient authors, particularly Plutarch, was the first of her dynasty to bother learning the Egyptian language. The first in nearly 3 centuries of rule. She spoke 9 languages: Egyptian, Ethiopian, Arabian, Aramaic, Parthian, and others. This was a political gesture. She wanted to communicate with the people directly, without a translator. But the very fact that none of her predecessors thought it necessary to learn the language of the country they ruled speaks volumes. Genetically, she was primarily Greek or Macedonian. Culturally, she was deeply Hellenized. Alexandria, her capital, was one of the centers of the Greek world. When she conducted religious ceremonies in the guise of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, it was a carefully crafted political strategy to legitimize her power, not an expression of her true identity. Cleopatra, as the embodiment of the mysterious East and the exotic Nile, is an image primarily created by Rome, which viewed her as a foreign threat who had seduced two great generals. This image was later adopted by the Renaissance, Romanticism, and Hollywood. Each era shaped Cleopatra to fit its needs, making her increasingly Egyptian, more exotic, and darker with each interpretation. The real Cleopatra was a woman of sharp political acumen, educated in the Hellenistic tradition, who read philosophers and had an interest in medicine. Her strength lay not in the mysterious East, but in an intellect that frightened her opponents far more than any exoticism. This is no less an exciting story, but it is a different story altogether. Myth number 4. Maya, the end of the world calendar. On December 21, 2012, millions of people around the world, from housewives in Texas to professors in Berlin, awaited the end of the world with varying degrees of anxiety. Bunkers were sold. Canned goods were sold. Some tourists traveled to Mexico and Guatemala to meet the apocalypse where it was supposedly foretold. This was dubbed the Maya prophecy, and it was based on one fact. This date marked the end of another great cycle of the Maya calendar, known as the 13th Baktun. What did the Maya themselves actually say about this date? Almost nothing resembling an apocalypse. To understand, we need to unravel their concept of time. The Maya used several parallel calendar systems. One of them, the so-called long count, tracked major eras. The 13th Baktun is a period lasting about 5,125 years. On December 21, 2012, this cycle came to an end. For the Maya, this meant roughly the same as our new millennium, the end of a significant counting period and the beginning of another. Solemn? Yes. Apocalyptic? No. On a monument from Tortuguero, one of the few inscriptions mentioning this date, there is a reference to the appearance of the god Bolon Yokte, associated with war and creation. This is not a prophecy of destruction. It's a description of a ritual event marking the beginning of a new era. Modern scholars, particularly researchers from Tulane University who are deciphering Maya scripts, have spent years trying to explain that there is no apocalypse in Maya texts. They have not been heard. Where did the idea of the end of the world come from? Much of it emerged from the works of Western esoteric thinkers in the 60s and 80s who imposed their apocalyptic fantasies onto a calendar they did not fully understand. Books like Galactic Synchronization by Jose Arguelles sparked an entire industry of fear, unrelated to the actual texts and beliefs of the Maya. Essentially, it was a Western apocalyptic narrative dressed in the exotic garb of an ancient civilization. What's particularly bitter is that while the world debated the Mayan prophecy, the living descendants of this culture, over 8 million people speaking Maya languages in Mexico and Central America today, watched with irritation and fatigue. Their ancestors were turned into the authors of Hollywood catastrophism. Their culture became a backdrop for foreign anxieties. Myth number 5. Ancient Rome. A thumbs down meant death. The crowd roars. A gladiator stands over a fallen opponent, sword poised at his throat. Thousands of eyes are fixated on the organizer's box. A plump hand slowly turns a thumb down, and this signifies the end. The spectators demand blood. The sword drops. This scene has played out in countless paintings, novels, and films. Thumbs down has become a universal symbol of condemnation. We use it on social media, in casual conversation, and in app interfaces. The problem is that in ancient Rome, thumbs down likely meant exactly the opposite. It all began with a painting by the French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme, created in 1872. It was titled Pollice Verso, with the turned thumb. In it, the victorious gladiator stands over the fallen one, while the crowd, with thumbs pointed down, calls for his death. The painting was a massive success, a cultural sensation, and reproduced worldwide. Jerome was a virtuoso painter, capable of creating compelling historical scenes. The trouble was his disregard for historical accuracy. The Latin phrase pollice verso literally means with the turned thumb, but there's no indication of which direction that thumb is turned. Ancient sources describing gestures of mercy or death in the arena are extremely scarce and contradictory. Scholars, particularly Professor Anthony Creer, who consulted primary sources, found that the gesture of raised thumb in Rome could mean kill, as it symbolized a drawn sword. Meanwhile, a thumb pressed against the palm or hidden away signified sheath the sword, or in other words, spare the life. Thus, the gesture that today means like, approve, or good on social media may have originally indicated death, and the thumbs down gesture we use to express disapproval might have meant life. This 19th century artist inadvertently flipped the entire cultural code upside down, and the world readily accepted this version because it was more appealing, because Jerome's painting was persuasive, because the real sources were less captivating than great art. It's important to pause here and consider the mechanism that allowed a single painting to rewrite historical reality in the collective consciousness. Jerome was a painter of the so-called academic Orientalism, an artist who specialized in depicting the East and antiquity with remarkable attention to detail, clothing, architecture, everyday objects. His paintings were viewed as documentary, precisely because they contained so many convincing details. Viewers saw accurately rendered helmets, realistic mosaics on arena floors, and believable crowds in the stands, and began to trust the whole scene, including the gesture of the thumb. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as the illusion of reality. When many details are correct, we tend to accept as true what might not be. Jerome created a flawless backdrop for his painting, which allowed him to sneak in a historical error that lasted for 150 years. The painting Pollice Verso was purchased in 1875 by American entrepreneur Elias Latreille and transported to the United States. It inspired Cecil B. DeMille in making the first Hollywood epics. Through film, this image spread around the world. One person, one painting, one mistake, and 2 billion people inherited an incorrect gesture in their cultural legacy. Myth number 6. Ancient Egypt, hieroglyphs were lost forever. Imagine 2,000 years of silence. The language spoken by the pharaohs, inscribed on the walls of Karnak and in papyrus scrolls, was dead. No one could read it. Medieval scholars looked at the walls of Egyptian temples and saw only mysterious drawings. They believed that each symbol held a deep mystical meaning, a secret revelation hidden by priests from the uninitiated. This belief persisted for nearly 2 millennia. European alchemists and mystics built entire philosophical systems upon it. The very word hermetic, meaning sealed, impenetrable, originated from this tradition, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a pseudo-Egyptian sage said to have deciphered the secrets of hieroglyphs. In 1799, French soldiers of Napoleon's army discovered a stone slab near the city of Rosetta, inscribed in 3 languages: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic, and ancient Greek. It was a copy of a decree from 196 BC honoring King Ptolemy V. Since Greek was known to scholars, the slab offered a theoretical opportunity to crack the hieroglyphic code. But transitioning from theory to practice proved challenging. For the next 23 years, the best minds in Europe grappled with the Rosetta Stone. Thomas Young, a brilliant English physicist, made significant initial strides. He realized that some symbols represented sounds, not just ideas. But it was French scholar Jean-François Champollion who completely deciphered the system in 1822. He announced his discovery in a letter in September, which became historic. But here's what's often left out of the standard recounting of this story. Champollion did not work solely with the Rosetta Stone. The key to his breakthrough was his knowledge of the Coptic language, the late Egyptian language of Christian communities in Egypt that never fully died out. Coptic monks and priests continued to use it in their services. Champollion studied Coptic from a young age and realized that it was a direct descendant of the language of the pharaohs. This understanding helped him determine the sounds behind the mysterious symbols. Thus, the hieroglyphs were lost only to Western science, fascinated by mystical fantasies. In reality, the thread connecting the language of Ramses II to the language of Coptic Christians has never been broken. It may have thinned and become invisible to those unwilling to see it, but it was there. The story of a completely forgotten language was more appealing than the tale of a language that lived on in the prayers of quiet monasteries. But the truth lies in this reality. Myth number 7. The Maya, the mysterious disappearance of a civilization. Where did the Maya go? This question has been asked in documentaries, books, magazines, and school textbooks for decades. The image of abandoned cities swallowed by jungles, ruins left void of life, has firmly established itself in popular culture. The Maya disappeared, suddenly, mysteriously, leaving behind their magnificent structures and undeciphered inscriptions. It remains one of history's greatest mysteries. With one small detail: the Maya didn't go anywhere. Today, more than 8 million people in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador identify as Maya and speak languages from the Maya language family. They are not distant descendants who have lost touch with their ancestors. They represent a living culture with an unbroken tradition, language, rituals, and memory. So, what then disappeared? Several major urban centers in the southern lowlands, Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, collapsed between the 8th and 10th centuries of our era. This phenomenon is known among scholars as the Classic Period collapse. However, this is not the disappearance of a civilization, but rather the decline of specific political centers. The populations of these cities did not evaporate, they migrated. Some moved north, to the Yucatan, where Maya civilization continued to thrive. Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Mayapan became new centers of power during the post-classic period. Others settled in rural areas. Why then do the Maya seem to have disappeared in collective imagination? This is largely explained by how European researchers in the 19th century approached the discovery of the ruins. They saw jungle-covered cities but did not see living Maya, because they did not want to. The colonial logic suggested that true Maya were the builders of temples, rather than the people living near the ruins who could be asked for directions. John Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, the first systematic researchers of Maya ruins in the 1830s and 40s, described the majestic buildings and clearly felt a dissonance between them and the people around. This dissonance was resolved simply. The true Maya were declared to have vanished, while their living descendants were deemed random inheritors, disconnected from the glory of their ancestors. This was a colonial lie that became a scientific myth, and it continues to live on in the headlines of documentaries. The collapse of the classic Maya period is a real phenomenon that remains only partly understood today. It seems to have resulted from a combination of factors: prolonged droughts that disrupted water supply systems and agriculture, political instability following a period of intense warfare, possibly ecological degradation caused by deforestation for construction and agricultural needs, and likely epidemics. This is not the sole cause, nor the only scenario. Scholars continue to debate the weight of each factor. Yet, even in the most devastated regions of the southern lowlands, there was no complete disappearance. Palenque was abandoned around 950 CE, but nearby villages continued to thrive. Tikal, by the same time, significantly reduced its population, yet signs of life persisted there for several more centuries. It was not a catastrophic destruction, but rather a gradual dispersal. What happened next is also part of the story that the narrative of disappearance omits. The Maya didn't vanish. In several regions, they experienced spiritual and political revival. The state of Colonial in northern Yucatan lasted until the early Spanish conquest in the 16th century. Some Maya rulers fiercely resisted the Spaniards. The ruler of Itza, the last independent Maya state on Lake Tayasal, maintained independence until 1697, nearly 200 years after the first contact with the Spaniards. When people say the Maya vanished, they ignore the ruler of the island, who fought against conquistadors in the 17th century. They neglect the peasant uprising in Yucatan in the 19th century, known as the Caste War. led by Maya communities seeking to restore their autonomy. They don't mention that Maya languages today are recognized as official in Guatemala, or that Maya communities engage in political struggle for land rights and cultural recognition. Disappearance is not the story of the Maya. It's a story of a perspective that refused to see continuity. Myth number 8. Ancient Rome, Romans hated Julius Caesar. The Ides of March. March 15th, 44 BCE. In the theater of Pompey, a group of conspiratorial senators surrounds Gaius Julius Caesar. 23 stab wounds, blood on the marble floor. The great dictator falls, and, according to the famous account, utters his last words to Brutus. This is a scene everyone knows. This is an event that changed the world. The standard version of the story, shaped largely through Shakespeare and his tragedy, suggests that the people of Rome supported the conspirators because Caesar had become a tyrant, threatening republican freedoms. Brutus and Cassius acted in the name of the people. The murder was met with, if not jubilation, then understanding. In reality, it happened quite the opposite. When news of the assassination spread through the city, the people of Rome erupted in rage, not joy. The conspirators had hoped to restore the republic and gain popular support. Instead, they received hostility. Brutus delivered a speech at the forum, but the crowd did not break into applause. They remained coldly silent or openly expressed their dislike. The funeral of Caesar a few days later turned into an impromptu popular uprising. When Mark Antony read the dictator's will, in which Caesar left each Roman citizen 75 denarii and bequeathed his gardens for public use, the crowd erupted in grief and anger. People carried torches to the body. Someone set fire to buildings near the forum. Caesar had implemented significant reforms that directly improved the lives of ordinary citizens. He reduced debt burdens, distributed land to veterans, and organized public works. He was a populist in the truest sense, and the people's love for him was real, not fabricated. The conspirators killed a man who was loved by those for whom they claimed to act. This was a catastrophic political mistake. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome a few weeks after the assassination. A civil war broke out. The republic they tried to save was lost for good, and it was they who killed it, believing they were preserving it. Shakespeare, of course, understood the tragic irony of this situation. However, popular culture extracted a different message from his play, creating the image of a tyrant that needed to be eliminated. The real story is more complex and sorrowful. It is about people who killed a beloved leader for ideals that the common folk did not consider their own. There's another detail of this story that is often overlooked. Brutus, the central figure of the conspiracy, the man Caesar genuinely loved and trusted, was the son of a woman named Servilia, with whom Caesar had a long-standing affair. Some ancient authors even suggested that Brutus was Caesar's own son, though most modern historians reject this for chronological reasons. Caesar promoted Brutus in his career, defended his interests, and saw him as an heir to a certain political legacy. When Caesar saw Brutus among his assassins, a man he had singled out, had a fondness for, and perhaps regarded almost as a son, the words spoken by him in Shakespeare's play, Et tu, Brute, likely convey not just a historical fact, but the psychological truth of the situation. A man who was killed by those he considered his own. After the assassination, Brutus and Cassius were unable to seize the moment. They had no plan for the next day. They hoped that the Senate and the people would rally to restore the Republic with enthusiasm. Instead, they found that Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally, immediately took the initiative. Antony's speech at Caesar's funeral, regardless of how closely the Shakespearean text aligns with reality, was a masterclass in politics. He did not directly accuse the conspirators, but gradually turned the crowd against them. It was a battle for the narrative, and Antony won it. Myth number 9. Ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun was a great pharaoh. Gold. Tons of gold. Sarcophagi made of pure gold, golden masks, golden jewelry, golden models of boats. When Howard Carter uncovered the tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1922, the world was left in indescribable awe. Tutankhamun became the most famous pharaoh in history. His face, or rather his death mask, became the face of ancient Egypt. Millions of people are convinced he was a great ruler, whose glory was so immense that his burial was astonishingly rich. The irony is that Tutankhamun was likely one of the least significant pharaohs in the entire history of Egypt during his lifetime. He ascended to the throne at around 9 years old. He died, presumably from a series of coinciding illnesses and injuries, including malaria and a broken leg, at 18 or 19. His reign lasted about 9 years. During this time, there were no major military victories, monumental construction projects, or reforms that traditionally make pharaohs great. The name Tutankhamun means living embodiment of Amun. He was primarily a tool for religious restoration after his father's, Akhenaten's revolutionary rule, which attempted to establish monotheism. Tutankhamun returned Egypt to its traditional pantheon, an important task, but more administrative than heroic. His tomb was filled with gold not because he was great, it was filled with gold because Egypt was wealthy, and the tradition of burying pharaohs required providing them with everything needed for the afterlife. Much more significant pharaohs, Ramses II, Thutmose III, Seti I, left tombs that were looted in antiquity. Tutankhamun found himself among the few who were fortunate. His tomb remained untouched. Not because he was feared to disturb, simply because the entrance was accidentally blocked by rubble from the construction of a nearby tomb, and at some point, it was forgotten. Tutankhamun's worldwide fame is, in a literal sense, the glory of a randomly preserved archive. We are struck not by his greatness, but by the preservation of his possessions. It's a powerful metaphor about the nature of historical memory. We remember not those who were important, but those whose traces survived. Howard Carter, who opened the tomb, spent nearly 10 years working on its excavation, from 1922 to 1932. It was an enormous task, 5,438 items, each needing to be documented, preserved, and described. Among them were everyday items, sandals, board games, walking sticks, things a teenager took into the afterlife because they were cherished in life. Alongside golden sarcophagi and ritual statues, they paint a picture not of a god or a monument, but of a boy who loved to hunt, play board games, and wear colorful collars. Medical studies of his mummy, conducted in the 21st century using computed tomography, depict a picture of a physically unhealthy young man, a fused palate, possibly accompanied by a cleft palate, several fractures, signs of malaria, and Kohler's disease, a condition affecting the bone of the foot. He almost certainly limped. Among the items found in the tomb were 130 walking sticks and scepters. That's astonishing for an 18-year-old boy. Thus, the most famous pharaoh in history was a weak, sickly child who ruled the country during a time of political instability following his father's religious revolution. His advisors, Ai and Horemheb, were the ones truly governing the nation. He was the face of the regime, not its brain. His fame arrived 3,300 years later, and it came because a rockfall buried the entrance to his tomb just in time, hiding it from tomb raiders who had ravaged everything around. Myth number 10. The Maya could not write. This belief was so widespread in Western academia during the 19th and even the 20th century that some researchers outright denied the Mayan writing system. It's not an alphabet, they said. It's not a syllabary. It's just a series of pictograms, religious symbols, decorative elements. A system that nobody could read was conveniently declared unreadable by nature. The truth came to light slowly, largely thanks to Soviet linguist Yuri Knodosov, who was working in Leningrad in the post-war years. Knodosov had never been to Mexico. He worked with photocopies of the 3 surviving Mayan books, so-called codices, as well as with the manuscript of Spanish monk Diego de Landa, who described the Mayan writing system in the 16th century and recorded how individual signs were pronounced. De Landa, infamous for personally burning dozens of Mayan manuscripts in 1562, ironically left behind the key to deciphering what he was destroying. In 1952, Konorosov published a paper in which he proved that Mayan writing is syllabic. Each sign represents a syllable or sound, not just an idea. It was a system that could be read if one knew the correspondence between signs and sounds. The Western academic community met his work with cold skepticism, partly because they were reluctant to accept a discovery from a Soviet scientist in the midst of the Cold War. One of the leading American epigraphers of that time, Eric Thompson, spent years actively resisting the recognition of Nourasov's theory. However, time eventually set things straight. By the 80s, Nourasov's work, developed and refined by other scholars, made it possible to read Mayan inscriptions. Today, about 90% of all known texts have been deciphered. And those texts turned out to be far from what those who called them simple pictograms expected. They include history, poetry, astronomy, political chronicles, and genealogy. It is a rich, multi-layered literature. A civilization that was considered illiterate for a century and a half had one of the most sophisticated written traditions of the ancient world. Nourasov, who passed away in 1999, lived to see that recognition, but the struggle for it cost him half of his scientific career. Nourasov's story deserves special attention. He was born in 1922 in Kharkiv. During World War II, he participated in combat. After the war, he found himself in Moscow and began studying ancient writing systems. According to legend, possibly a partly apocryphal one, his interest in the Maya sparked after he accidentally read an article by an American scholar who claimed that Maya writing would never be deciphered. For a young linguist, this sounded like a challenge. He requested copies of 3 surviving Maya codices and the manuscripts of Diego de Landa. They sent him photocopies. He had never been to Mexico. He had no computers, no international conferences, and no colleagues to discuss ideas in real time. All he had was a study, those photocopies, and a stubborn analytical mind. In 1952, he published a paper. The reaction from Eric Thompson, the leading Western Maya scholar of the time, was almost caricatured in its bias. He wrote a scathing review that ridiculed both Nourasov's conclusions and his methods. Thompson was convinced that Maya writing could not be syllabic because the Maya were a, quote, spiritual people whose script expressed ideas rather than sounds. This was not scientific reasoning. It was an ideological stance dressed up in scientific language. The rivalry between Nourasov and Thompson stretched over 2 decades. Thompson died in 1975 without ever admitting his mistake. By that time, other researchers, especially Tatyana Proskoryakova, who proved in the 1960s that the texts on Maya stelae describe real historical rulers and not abstract cosmic events, were already moving in the direction indicated by Nourasov. In 1994, the government of Guatemala awarded Nourasov the Order of Quetzalcoatl, the country's highest honor in the field of culture. It was his first visit to Mesoamerica. He was 72 years old. Myth number 11. Ancient Rome. The Romans invented concrete, and then forgot it. The Pantheon in Rome. A dome with a diameter of 43 meters, cast without a single supporting column inside, standing for nearly 2,000 years without significant restoration. Engineers and architects continue to marvel at it today. How is this possible? The answer is Roman concrete, opus cementitium, which possesses properties superior to many modern equivalents. And here, a captivating narrative emerges in popular history. A great technology lost after the fall of Rome, forgotten for an entire millennium, only rediscovered in modern times. It's a beautiful story. But it comes with serious caveats. Firstly, Roman concrete was not lost in the sense of complete oblivion. Its composition, limestone, volcanic ash, seawater, and aggregate of stone and brick, was generally known. Medieval builders continued to use lime mortars and pozzolans. The narrative of lost technology arose largely because medieval constructions made using similar materials did not achieve the same quality. But this is a matter of recipe and execution, not complete forgetfulness of the principle. Secondly, what made Roman concrete truly unique was only revealed in the 21st century. A group of researchers led by Marie D'Agostino and Tizia Wolverton, who worked with samples taken from Roman marine structures, discovered that the secret to its durability lies not just in the mix's composition, but in the chemical reaction that occurs when it comes into contact with seawater. Crystals of aluminum tobermorite gradually fill the tiniest cracks, and over time, the concrete doesn't deteriorate. Instead, it literally becomes stronger. This finding was published in 2017. Therefore, the Romans created a self-healing material, likely without fully understanding why it worked the way it did. They knew that specific proportions yielded the desired results, but they lacked a molecular explanation. This was practical knowledge without theoretical understanding. What was lost was not the formula. It was preserved within the structures. What was lost was the comprehension of why that formula worked. And this subtle distinction makes the story far more intriguing than any tale of a forgotten technology. Puzzolana, volcanic ash that the Romans sourced from Pozzuoli near Naples, the very word puzzolana comes from the name of this town, turned out to be a key ingredient not only because of its chemical properties, but also due to its availability. The volcanic activity of the Apennine Peninsula provided Rome with a natural resource that the Egyptians or Greeks simply didn't have. This is one reason why so many magnificent structures exist in central Italy. Nature supplied the necessary material right at hand. When the center of civilization shifted north and east in Europe, local builders worked with different materials. They didn't forget the recipe. They operated in different climatic and geological conditions where that recipe just couldn't be reproduced with the same results. In other words, knowledge was inseparable from place. Taking it to another region meant losing the main ingredient. Meanwhile, the Pantheon still stands. Its dome is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Its central opening, the oculus, with a diameter of about 9 meters, was designed not as a structural weakness, but as a functional feature. Rainwater drains through it, the floor of the Pantheon is slightly sloped towards the center, and during the equinoxes and solstices, sunlight streams down precisely onto those parts of the floor and walls that appear to have been intentionally selected. The question of whether the astronomical orientation of the Pantheon was intentional remains open, and this alone speaks to the depth of the design that we are just beginning to understand. Myth number 12. Ancient Egypt, pharaohs were always men. The image of the pharaoh in popular consciousness is almost exclusively male. Warriors in golden chariots, pyramid builders, rulers of the world. Even the word pharaoh, which came into European languages through Greek and Latin traditions, carries a masculine form. Although the name Cleopatra is familiar to everyone, she is often viewed as an exception, seen as a Greek queen rather than a pharaoh. However, Egyptian history recognizes several rightful female rulers, and one of them was likely among the most successful pharaohs in the country's history. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled during the 15th century BCE in the New Kingdom era. Officially, she served as regent for her young nephew, Thutmose III. Yet, within her first few years as regent, she did something remarkable. She declared herself a full-fledged pharaoh. She began to wear the double crown. She was depicted with the traditional pharaoh's beard. Her name was inscribed in a cartouche just like any other king's, and it seems the country accepted this. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for 20 years. During this time, she organized an expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, likely present-day Eritrea or the coast of Somalia, returning with valuable incense, exotic animals, and plants. Grand structures were built, including the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, which is still considered a masterpiece of architecture today. Egypt experienced a period of stability and prosperity. After her death, Thutmose III, the very nephew she served as regent for, whom she had essentially usurped, systematically began erasing her name decades later. He would chisel away inscriptions from monuments, replacing her images with those of his father and of himself. This was not merely personal revenge. It was an attempt to rewrite official history and remove her from the list of legitimate rulers. For nearly 3,000 years, this destruction was largely successful. Her name was forgotten. It was only in the 19th century, as scholars began systematically comparing inscriptions and timelines, that they discovered a gap in Egypt's history, a name that had been erased, a woman pharaoh who had been made into nothing. Myth number 13. The Maya. The Maya lived in constant war and chaos. The Maya civilization is often portrayed as a world of unending ritual wars, cities ravaging each other in raids, and a society consumed by violence. This image gained popularity particularly after scholars began to decipher Maya texts in the late 20th century, uncovering numerous accounts of wars and captives. But it's essential to consider the proportions. Yes, wars between Maya city-states were a reality. Chronicles document conflicts between Tikal and Calakmul among lesser centers and their neighbors. Capturing high-ranking prisoners was an important part of military strategy. Captives from royal families held ritual significance. However, Maya wars were generally seasonal and limited in scale. They were not total confrontations that wiped out economies and populations. Furthermore, a significant portion of everyday life in Maya society was completely unrelated to war. It was a civilization with a thriving trade network: obsidian from Mexico, jade from Guatemala, sea salt from coastal areas, and cacao used as both currency and a luxury item. These were cities with advanced infrastructure, reservoir systems, markets, and administrative districts. It was a society with a multi-tiered social structure, comprising craftsmen, traders, and farmers. The image of the Maya as a civilization of war partly arose because the first deciphered inscriptions, most often found on official monuments and stelae, were essentially political and military records. This would be akin to a situation where future historians judged medieval Europe solely based on military chronicles and battle accounts, entirely overlooking information about trade, crafts, theology, and daily life. The true Maya world was far more diverse. This does not negate the reality of war, but it does not allow it to overshadow everything else. Myth number 14. Ancient Rome. The Senate governed Rome as a democratic body. Senate and People of Rome, SPQR. This abbreviation continues to grace the manhole covers of Rome, official documents, and tourist souvenirs. The Roman Senate is perceived as a prototype of parliamentary democracy, a place where free citizens discussed the fate of the republic and made decisions for the good of society. This idea was greatly admired by the founding fathers of the United States. They consciously used the Roman Republican model while creating American institutions. The real Senate of Rome operated somewhat differently. First, access to the Senate was reserved for citizens with property qualifications, initially only for patricians, descendants of several hundred original aristocratic families. Later, during the late Republic, it included wealthy plebeians and nobles, but it remained an institution of property elites. There was no popular representation in the modern sense. Second, the Senate largely functioned through a system of clientelism, informal obligations between patrons and clients that permeated Roman society. Voting in the Senate was often predetermined by negotiations, personal commitments, and family ties. Great oratorical duels, like those we see in movies, did occur, but the outcomes of many were known in advance. Third, the Senate had an advisory role, but not always a legislative one. Popular assemblies, comitia, formally held the right to pass laws. The Senate issued senatus consulta, decrees that held power only because magistrates executed them. The difference is subtle but important. It was not a legislative body in the modern understanding. Finally, in the late Roman period, the Senate increasingly became a decorative institution, its significance defined by how much a specific consul or dictator was willing to consider it. Caesar himself, who was killed for tyranny, was formally acting within constitutional powers. This made the situation all the more explosive. The systems meant to limit power repeatedly discovered they had no mechanisms for enforcement. SPQR on the sewers of Rome. It's a beautiful inscription. But behind this narrative lies not democracy, but an oligarchic republic where the majority of the city's population, slaves, freedmen, foreigners, women, had no political voice. Myth number 15. Ancient Egypt. The pyramids were built in silence and submission. The image of silent, submissive thousands dragging stone blocks under the scorching sun is so deeply ingrained by cinema and art that it feels almost tangible. The pharaoh, like a god, like the sun above the desert. The worker, merely a grain of sand. Quiet submission to overwhelming power. This is not just a myth of slavery, which we will address separately. It's a myth about the nature of the relationship between the builders and their work. So, what do we actually know about the people who built the pyramids? Since the 1990s, Egyptologists have discovered and systematically studied an entire city of builders near the Giza plateau. There were barracks, bakeries, breweries, and medical quarters, where the skeletons of workers show signs of surgical procedures, like amputations, after which individuals survived and returned to work. There were communal burials with burial goods, which is entirely inconsistent with the status of slaves in any culture. Slaves are not buried with honor. The workers were paid in grain, beer, cloth, and fish. Papyrus reports have survived detailing the diet of the pyramid builders. Meat, beef, mutton, appears in the diets of individuals with considerable social standing. One such document, the Merer papyrus, discovered in 2013 and dated to the time of Khufu, serves as a supply inspector's diary and describes the logistics of delivering limestone for pyramid construction. It's a bureaucratic document, meticulously kept by a professional administrator. But the most astonishing discovery concerns graffiti. Inside some pyramids and in the stone blocks themselves, inscriptions left by the workers have been found. The names of crews. Among these names are Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaura, those who know how to do it. This is worker humor. It reflects group identity. It's what people write when they take pride in their work, not when they are driven by whips. The Great Pyramid was not built in silence. It was constructed amidst noise, the smell of fresh beer and bread, among individuals who called themselves amusing names and left jokes on stones that will stand for millennia. Myth number 16. The Maya, cacao, was just a simple food. Cacao. Today, it's a bar of chocolate in your pocket, a hot beverage in a cafe, an ingredient in hundreds of desserts. Accessible, everyday, almost unnoticeable. When we discuss the history of cacao, we typically mention that it was discovered by the Maya, and that's where the conversation ends. A simple food that came to us from the jungle. But for the Maya, cacao was anything but simple. To start, the word cacao comes from the Maya term cacao. The cacao bean functioned as money, literally, within Maya culture. The number of beans was used for calculations, for payment, for trade transactions. Spanish colonizers, upon arriving in the New World, were surprised to find that the indigenous people kept in bags what they considered food and referred to it as money. At a 16th century Indian market, you could buy a large tomato for 1 bean, while a slave cost 100 beans. The cocoa drink, chocolatla, held ritual significance. It was made from ground roasted beans, water, and spices such as pepper, vanilla, and sometimes honey. This drink was served cold, shocking the first Europeans who expected it to be hot. It was a beverage for the elite, rulers, warriors, and priests. Common folk drank it rarely and only on special occasions. It was something between wine at an important dinner and communion at the temple. In Maya codices, the cacao tree is depicted as the world tree, the axis of the universe. The gods bestow cacao upon humans as a gift. This narrative mirrors the story of Prometheus and fire, something sacred handed down from above that requires respect and proper handling. When Cortés brought cacao to Spain in the 16th century, Europeans added sugar, transforming the sacred bitter drink into a dessert. This cultural transformation was so significant that the Maya rulers, who sipped chocolatl from ceremonial bowls before battles and rituals, would hardly recognize their sacred substance in a modern chocolate bar. Myth number 17. Ancient Rome, Latin was the language of the entire empire. Speaking Latin became synonymous with education, formality, and belonging to the civilized world. The Catholic Church used it for a millennium. Legal documents retained Latin phrasing until the 20th century. Science employed Latin for botanical and medical nomenclature. If any language could be considered the language of civilization, it was certainly Latin. Yet, at the height of its power, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia and from Morocco to the shores of the Black Sea. Latin was far from the only language in this vast territory, and it wasn't always the official one. In the eastern part of the empire, Greek predominated. This is no exaggeration. In Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece, administrative documents, correspondence, literature, and the everyday speech of the educated class were all conducted in Greek. When the Apostle Paul wrote his letters, he wrote in Greek. When a Roman governor in Egypt communicated with local officials, he wrote in Greek. Even Marcus Aurelius, one of the most famous Roman emperors, kept his renowned journal Meditations in Greek. In the military, the picture was different. Latin was the language used for commands, military administration, and contracts with soldiers. However, in the provinces, people spoke their own languages: Aramaic, Celtic dialects, Berber languages, and Coptic. Many never learned Latin. This was a multilingual empire managed by a bilingual elite, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, while local languages were preserved in daily life. The idea of a unified Latin civilization covering everything from Hadrian's Wall to the Tigris is a retrospective construct developed centuries after the fall of Rome, primarily through the efforts of the Catholic Church, which needed the idea of a single sacred language. Myth number 18. Ancient Egypt. Egyptians worshipped cats as gods. Cats in Egypt. Everyone knows about that. Cats were sacred. Killing a cat was a crime punished by death. The goddess Bastet had the head of a cat. There are millions of cat mummies. It's a fact. It's true. And yet, in popular perception, it has transformed into something fundamentally different from what it actually was. The Egyptians did not worship cats as beings endowed with divinity on their own. This is a crucial distinction. Egyptian religion was based on the concept that certain animals could embody a quality or aspect of a specific deity, and in certain contexts, represent their earthly manifestation. Bastet, in her early form, was a lion goddess and only later took on feline traits, becoming associated with domestic cats. She embodied maternal love, home protection, and fertility. The cat was valued for practical reasons. It exterminated mice and rats that ravaged grain stores, and that's why it was given a protective significance. Its killing was not punished because the cat was a god, but because it was under the protection of the goddess, her earthly incarnation. As for the millions of cat mummies, the story gets even more interesting. A study conducted in the early 2000s revealed that most cat mummies from the temples of Bastet were deliberately killed at a young age. They were votive offerings, sacrifices to the goddess, sold to pilgrims right at the temple. Next to the temples, there was a whole industry. Cats were specifically bred, killed, and mummified for sale as ritual souvenirs. This was not an atrocity. It was the norm of the religious market of that era. But it stands in stark contrast to the image of a society that deified every cat on the street. The reality was more pragmatic, commercial, and in some sense more humane. People bought a cat mummy to make an offering to the goddess, much like how one lights a candle in a church today. Myth number 19. The Maya. The Maya observatories were coincidences. When scholars in the 20th century began studying the orientation of buildings in Maya cities, the initial explanation was one of least effort, coincidence. Sure, this wall is oriented so that, on the day of the summer solstice, the sun sets precisely in the gap between two stones, but that's just a coincidence. Maya architects built for practical reasons, and there's no need to attribute to them astronomical knowledge, which, of course, they didn't possess. The accumulated evidence completely dismantled this position. The Maya conducted astronomical observations with astonishing accuracy. Their calculations of the Venusian cycle, the time between two appearances of Venus at the same point in the sky, differ from modern calculations by less than 2 minutes over a period of 500 years. This achievement was made without telescopes, without computers, using observations made with the naked eye through specially cut openings in the walls of buildings. The Caracol in Chichen Itza. The Caracol building in Chichen Itza is a round tower standing out in a city filled with rectangular structures. Upon closer examination, it becomes clear that its windows are aligned to observe the extreme points of Venus's rising and setting, as well as specific solar and lunar cycles. This isn't a coincidence. The Caracol served as an astronomical observatory integrated into the urban layout. In places like Palenque, Uxmal, and Copan, Across dozens of cities, buildings are oriented towards astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, and zenith passages, a phenomenon characteristic of tropical latitudes when the sun is directly overhead. This was not a random occurrence. It was a deliberate architectural program, born from centuries of observation and mathematical calculations. Why was this necessary? For agriculture, precise knowledge of the seasons dictated planting times. For rituals, many religious ceremonies were tied to astronomical events. For power, a ruler capable of controlling celestial happenings by predicting eclipses and the appearance of Venus held immense symbolic authority. The Maya did not merely look at the stars, they inscribed the sky into the stone of their cities. Myth number 20. Ancient Rome. Legionaries were exclusively Roman citizens. The red cloak, the eagle on the standard, the short sword called the gladius, and strict discipline. The legionary in popular imagination embodies the Roman citizen, a man fighting for his city, his republic, his empire. This is the image of a proud patrician transformed into a soldier. However, the reality of the late imperial period was fundamentally different. As the empire expanded and Italian sources for replenishing the army were depleted, legions increasingly recruited provincials. Initially, these were allies, then residents of border provinces, and eventually even barbarians. By the 3rd century CE, a significant portion of the legions consisted of natives from North Africa, Syria, the Danube provinces, and Britain. Their first language might not have been Latin. In the late empire, so-called federates emerged, barbarian military units fighting under their own commanders in service of Rome, while preserving their own traditions, languages, and internal structures. The Visigoths, Huns, and Alemanni fought alongside Roman armies throughout the 4th and 5th centuries. Most astonishingly, by this time, many Roman generals and even emperors had barbarian roots. Stilicho, one of the last great defenders of the Western Roman Empire in the early 5th century, was the son of a Vandal. Aetius, who defeated Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns and received his military training there. Dubbed the last Roman, he was raised by the enemies of Rome. The myth of an army embodying pure Roman citizenship crumbles at the first encounter with late imperial history. Rome survived for so long not because it maintained purity, but because it absorbed, integrated, and assimilated. When he stopped doing this and began to view everything foreign with suspicion, the machine started to stall. Myth number 21. Ancient Egypt. The Book of the Dead was a guide for everyone. The Book of the Dead is a term coined by the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius in the 19th century for a collection of magical texts that accompanied Egyptians into the afterlife. The image that forms in the public's mind is that of a vast, grim book filled with terrifying rituals carried by every Egyptian as a pass to the afterlife, as a manual for the dead. The reality was far more layered, personal, and commercial. Firstly, the Book of the Dead is not a single book. It is a title given by scholars to a collection of about 190 spells and ritual texts that evolved from earlier traditions, the pyramid texts, available only to pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, the coffin texts for the aristocracy, and finally, papyrus collections that became more accessible in the New Kingdom. However, more accessible does not mean available to all. Secondly, creating a papyrus with spells was an expensive endeavor. Scribes specializing in these texts worked in workshops that produced something like standardized copies with blank lines for the buyer's name. It was similar to a modern legal office where you pay to fill out forms with the required name. Most poorer Egyptians did not possess complete copies of these texts. Many were content with just a few key spells, or even managed without any written guidance. Thirdly, the purpose of these texts was not a mechanical instruction, but rather magical reinforcement. The spells were meant to protect the soul on its journey through the afterlife, assist during the judgment of Osiris, and provide sustenance in eternal life. This was a living religious practice, not a bureaucratic regulation. The image of the Book of the Dead as a dark universal manual for the entire Egyptian population is a projection of our understanding of books as mass objects onto a culture where books were luxury items available to few. Myth number 22, the Maya. The Maya discovered zero by accident, zero. A concept that lies at the heart of modern mathematics and computer science. Without zero, there is no binary code. Without zero, there is no positional number system, where the value of a digit depends on its place. Without zero, mathematics remains intuitive but fundamentally limited. It is believed that zero was independently invented in India around the 5th century CE, in the Arab world, from where it reached Europe, and in another civilization, the Maya. However, the Maya zero was not an accidental discovery. It was a conscious philosophical and mathematical concept developed long before the Common Era. The Maya utilized a base 20 vigesimal positional number system. In this system, the symbol for zero was structurally necessary. Without it, it would be impossible to distinguish, for example, 120 from 21. Zero in the Maya system was represented by a special symbol, a stylized shell or flower depending on the context, and was used as early as the 3rd century BCE. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. For the Maya, zero was not just a placeholder. It held deep ritual and philosophical significance. In their concept of time, zero was the starting point of a new cycle. Not a void, but a seed, a potential, the very first moment of existence. When one cycle ended and another began, the start date of the new cycle was marked by a series of zeros. This was not just a number. It was a symbol of rebirth. This idea, where zero embodies not emptiness but beginnings, is fundamentally different from the European view of zero, which for a long time was seen as nothing and rejected as an absurd concept. Medieval European mathematicians were suspicious of zero even in the 13th and 14th centuries, when Leonardo Fibonacci tried to introduce the Arabic-Indian numbering system. The Maya were ahead of this intellectual challenge by over 1,500 years and addressed it more elegantly, infusing zero with the positive meaning of beginnings rather than the negative connotation of absence. Myth number 23. Ancient Rome. The Colosseum was always full. Throughout history, the grand arena, 50,000 spectators, the roar of the crowd, the scent of blood and sand. This is the image that cinema has recreating thousands of times. The Colosseum as an eternal, pulsating center of life in Rome, where passion overflowed and destinies were decided. However, in the real history of the Colosseum, there were long periods of decline, neglect, and quite different uses that are rarely mentioned in tourist guides. The Flavian Amphitheater, the official name of the Colosseum, was built between 72 and 80 CE. Its heyday as an arena for gladiatorial fights and spectacles came during the first 3 centuries CE. However, by the 4th century, with the spread of Christianity and changes in aristocratic tastes, gladiatorial combat began to lose its appeal. According to legend, the first Christian monk named Telemachus intervened in a fight in the arena in an attempt to stop it, and was killed by the crowd. This event, dated around 400 CE, reportedly prompted Emperor Honorius to officially ban gladiatorial games. After that, the Colosseum was used for animal hunts for several more decades. Then, it became a residence. Literally, families settled in its arches and galleries. Medieval Rome was a city in ruins, and monumental ancient structures were transformed into fortresses and homes. The powerful Frangipani family used the Colosseum as a fortified residence in the 12th century. Stone from its walls was carried away for centuries to build new structures, including St. Peter's Basilica and several Roman palaces. What we see today is only a third of the original structure. The rest has been dismantled. The Eternal Arena was simultaneously a stone quarry. Myth number 24. Ancient Egypt. Mummification was for all Egyptians. Death in Egypt, bandages, canopic jars, scarab beetles, the journey through Duat, the judgment of Osiris, eternal life. When we think of death in Egypt, we often imagine mummification as a universal practice, a rite that every Egyptian underwent to enter the afterlife. The reality was harsher and uneven. Full-scale mummification, Organ removal, special oils and resins, intricate bandaging, and Anubis rituals was an expensive, multi-week process available only to wealthy Egyptians. There were different levels of mummification, a costly option for the elite, a mid-range choice for prosperous city dwellers, and a much cheaper method that used simpler techniques. However, even the less expensive option cost money that the poorest citizens didn't have. Most common Egyptians were buried differently. Their bodies were laid directly in the desert sand. Here, nature sometimes achieved what even the most skilled embalmer could not. The hot, dry sand dehydrated the bodies so quickly that they naturally mummified. Some of these sand mummies have been preserved better than many artificial ones, complete with skin, hair, and even facial expressions. Moreover, it was likely the observation of this natural phenomenon that inspired Egyptians to develop artificial embalming techniques. They saw how the desert preserved bodies and sought to replicate that effect. The costly rituals we associate with ancient Egyptian death culture may have originated from humble practices, derived from what happened to the bodies of people buried without ceremony in the sandy desert. The luxury of aristocratic afterlife rested on the foundation of a serendipitous discovery in an unknown grave. Myth number 25. Maya. Maya cities were isolated from each other. The jungles of Central America crafted an illusion of isolation. Dense forests, a lack of horses, and no wheels. How could cities separated by hundreds of kilometers of impenetrable brush maintain contact? Logic suggested that each Maya city lived its own separate life, with its own culture and gods. But the trade routes of the Maya were among the most intricate commercial systems in pre-Columbian America. Obsidian, a volcanic glass highly valued for making cutting tools, was sourced from various locations in Mexico and Guatemala. Its artifacts have been found thousands of kilometers from these sources, in Yucatan, Belize, and Honduras. Jade, mined in Guatemala, traveled north all the way to Teotihuacan. Shells from marine mollusks found in the Caribbean and Pacific coasts appeared in the interior regions. Teotihuacan, a great metropolis in central Mexico, located outside the actual Maya territory, actively traded with Maya cities. Within Teotihuacan, there was an entire quarter that scholars have dubbed the Maya Embassy, suggesting this was where merchants or diplomats from Maya cities resided. In ancient Maya cities, artifacts produced in Teotihuacan have been discovered. Connections were maintained not only through trade, but also through diplomatic marriages, military alliances, and counter-alliances. Tikal and Calakmul waged what modern researchers refer to as Star Wars, enlisting allies from dozens of cities. This was international politics in the truest sense, complete with strategies, betrayals, and temporary truces. The Maya world was closely interconnected by invisible threads of trade, diplomacy, and warfare. The jungles did not isolate, they served as pathways. Myth number 26. Ancient Rome. Rome fell in 476. A date taught in every school, 476 AD. The leader of German mercenaries, Odoacer, dismisses the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. That's it. Rome fell. The curtain drops. The Middle Ages began. This is the most convenient date in history, and one of the most arbitrary. Firstly, Romulus Augustulus was only a 16-year-old boy, placed on the throne by his general father just a few months prior. His authority was not recognized by the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. He was more of a puppet than an emperor, and his resignation did not spark much interest among his contemporaries. Secondly, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, continued to exist for nearly 1,000 years after this date. Constantinople fell in 1453. The Byzantines called themselves Romans. They saw themselves as direct heirs to Rome and had strong reasons for this belief. Thirdly, many Roman institutions continued to function in Western Europe after 476. Legal norms, administrative structures, and Latin as the language of the church and education. Germanic kings, who succeeded Roman governors, often sought formal recognition from Constantinople, wishing to legitimize their authority through Roman prestige. The date of the fall of Rome was coined by historians of later centuries, particularly the 18th century historian Edward Gibbon, author of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, who needed a convenient starting point for the narrative of the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. Rome did not fall in a single day. Rather, it slowly transformed into something else over several centuries. Myth number 27. Ancient Egypt. Egypt was an isolated civilization. The Nile Valley is the heart of the world, surrounded by deserts on all sides, a closed, impenetrable, self-sufficient civilization that turned inward for millennia. This image of Egypt as an island surrounded by sands seems intuitively correct, and that's why it is so enduring. However, Egypt was one of the most active participants in the trade and diplomatic networks of the ancient Near East. During the New Kingdom, roughly from 1600 to 1000 BCE, Egyptian pharaohs actively corresponded with the kings of the Hittites, Mitanni, Babylon, and other powers. The Amarna letters, discovered in the late 19th century in Egypt, contain several hundred clay tablets filled with diplomatic correspondence written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time, comparable to modern English. Kings exchanged gifts, requested lapis lazuli from Afghanistan in return for Egyptian gold, arranged marriages for their daughters, and complained to one another about breaches of obligation. Egyptian merchants traded with Punt in the south, with Byblos and Ugarit in the north, and with Cyprus and Crete across the Mediterranean Sea. Lebanese cedar was imported into Egypt for shipbuilding and elite furniture, as this wood was not found in Egypt. Copper from Sinai and Cyprus fueled Egypt's metal production, while Egyptian grain and linen fabrics flowed in the opposite direction. During the later period of Egypt, Phoenician merchants and then Greek settlers established themselves in the Nile Delta. The city of Naucratis was founded as a Greek trading outpost with the pharaoh's permission in the 7th century BCE. Egypt was not an island, it was a crossroads. The isolation of Egypt is an illusion created by the desert. The Nile was a road open in all directions, especially for those skilled in shipbuilding. Myth number 28. The Maya and their astronomy was primitive. Without telescopes, without mathematical tools of the European kind, without a system of data recording understandable to Western scholars until the 20th century, the logic suggested that Mayan astronomy was, of course, something interesting but primitive, based on superstitions rather than genuine observation. This stance did not survive the clash with facts. Let's consider the Dresden Codex, one of the 3 surviving Maya handwritten codices stored in Germany. A significant portion of it is dedicated to Venus tables. The Maya tracked the synodic period of Venus, the time between 2 consecutive appearances of the planet in the same point in the sky relative to Earth. The modern length of this period is 223 days and 23 hours. The figure in the Dresden Codex is 223 days and 24 hours. The difference is 1 hour per cycle, an error of less than 1/24%. This is not primitiveness. This is the result of centuries of systematic observation, data accumulation, intergenerational verification, and mathematical correction. The same codex contains tables of lunar eclipses. The Maya could predict eclipses not because they, quote, understood astronomy in an abstract sense, but because they accumulated data over centuries of observation that allowed them to calculate cycles with enough accuracy for practical use. This is empirical science in its purest form: observation, recording, pattern seeking, and verification. The Dresden Codex contains what modern scholars have identified as mathematical correction factors, correction tables, used by Maya priests to compensate for discrepancies between their calculations and the actual sky. This was not just addition and subtraction, it involved managing the errors in their predictive model. It's impossible to call this astronomy primitive. It can be described as different in its methods, conceptual language, and objectives, but in terms of accuracy, it is comparable to European astronomy of the 17th and 18th centuries in several areas. Myth number 29. Ancient Rome. All roads originally led to Rome. This phrase has become a saying. All roads lead to Rome is a metaphor suggesting that everything returns to the source, that the center attracts everything. Literally, it's understood as a description of the road system that Rome built to manage its empire. All paths radiate outward from the eternal city. The real history of roads is more complex and interesting. Firstly, the famous golden milestone, Millennium or Reum, erected by Augustus in the Roman Forum as a symbolic zero point for all roads, was primarily a political monument rather than a practical navigation tool. Roads were built not from the center to the periphery, but based on military needs, where the army established them. Many roads began with the conquest of new territories and stretched to the nearest provincial capital or military camp, not directly to Rome. Secondly, many Roman roads were constructed based on pre-existing routes. In Gaul, Spain, and Britain, local road networks existed long before the legions arrived. Rome often simply paved over and standardized what was already there. Thirdly, the road system itself was regional, not globally centralized. There were regional hubs, Mediolanum, Milan, Lugdunum, Lyon, Londinium, London, and local roads primarily led to them, rather than directly across the empire to Rome. A journey from Britain to Rome took several weeks and involved crossing multiple regional networks. But what was truly revolutionary was the standardization, a unified road width, standardized milestone markers, legal guarantees for road use, an IN system, a state postal service. This was not a system of everything to the center. It was a system of everything connected. And this distinction is fundamental. Not a funnel pulling everything in, but a network allowing for free movement. Myth number 30. The Maya. The Maya civilization was monolithic. This is the final story of our series, and it perhaps captures the essence of all the previous ones. When we say Maya, we imply something unified, one people, one culture, one civilization. The Maya built pyramids. The Maya invented zero. The Maya predicted eclipses. This is a convenient way to speak about history, through generalization, through the concept of a monolith. But the Maya is not a monolith. It is a family of related cultures, languages, and city-states connected by common roots, but lacking a single statehood, unified language, or singular culture. Today, there are more than 30 languages in the Mayan family. There were likely just as many during the classical period. Cholti, Yucatec, Quiche, Tzotzil, Tzeltal. These are not dialects of one language, but independent languages that speakers can understand with difficulty or not at all. The ruler of Tikal and the ruler of Copan seemingly communicated through translators. The architecture of the Maya cities showcases remarkable regional diversity. The pyramids of Tikal are steep, with crest-like structures at the top. The Rio Bec style in Yucatan built imitation towers with decorative staircases that were impractical for climbing. Copan in Honduras is famous for its sculpture, the most lifelike within the Maya world. Palenque is known for its elegant proportions and almost Renaissance lightness. Each center developed its own artistic language. The religious pantheon was also not uniform. Gods had different names in different regions, possessed various attributes, and participated in distinct myths. Kukulkan among the Yucatec Maya corresponded to Quetzalcoatl among the Aztecs, essentially the same character, a feathered serpent, but with a unique story in each tradition. When Spanish conquistadors encountered the Maya in the 16th century, they faced a fragmented world, city-states scattered across a vast territory, each with its rulers, interests, and histories of mutual wars and alliances. Some willingly assisted the Spaniards against their longtime enemies. This was not a betrayal of a unified people. It was politics in a world without a singular nation. The monolith of the Maya is our invention. It is a convenient label imposed on a vast, diverse, and vibrant cultural landscape. The civilization was real, and its achievements were tangible. However, it never existed as a single entity in the way we tend to imagine. And this is how all 30 stories you've just heard are connected. Each myth arose not from malice. Almost all were born from the desire to simplify, embellish, or dramatize reality. Nero with his lyre was needed because we require villains with clear motives. The she-wolf was necessary because the founder of an empire should be born of nature's power, not raised by a woman of questionable reputation. The Maya disappeared because living peoples don't fit conveniently into the romance of lost civilizations. History has always been a battleground between what was and what we would like to see. Myths prevailed not because they were more convincing, but because they were more beautiful. more convenient, clearer. Yet behind each myth lies the story of living people, complex, contradictory, humorous, and tragic. Workers who called their crews the drunkards of Menkaure, a female pharaoh erasing her name from memory. A Soviet linguist deciphering Maya script in post-war Leningrad who had never set foot in Mexico. Living descendants of the disappeared civilization, watching the world debate about their ancestors. Truth is always more fantastical than myth. It just demands greater attention. Epilogue: Why myths outlast truth. After reading these 30 stories, one might wonder, why? Why do such persistent misconceptions crumble upon the first inquiry into the sources? Why has Nero, with his lyre, survived thousands of historical monographs, proving his absence in Rome at the time of the fire? Why do the Maya continue to disappear in documentaries, while 8 million of their descendants still live on the same land? Why does a thumbs down still signify death, even though the story behind it has long been clarified? The answer lies in the nature of human memory, not as individuals, but collectively. Collective memory, unlike an archive, doesn't strive for accuracy, it seeks meaning. It looks for narratives that make sense of the world, making it easier to navigate. A tyrant burning his own city serves as a warning about the nature of unchecked power. A civilization disappearing without a trace reminds us of the fragility of all human creation. A thumbs down deciding the fate of a gladiator offers a stark clarity where life and death fit into a single gesture. These images function like parables. This is both their strength and their danger. The danger isn't simply an incorrect date or name. The danger lies in how simplified images of the past shape our simplified judgments about the present. When we perceive the Maya as extinct, we unconsciously devalue the living people who bear that name today. When we envision Rome as a singular Latin civilization, we fuel narratives about the purity of cultures, which history complicates at every turn. When we see Cleopatra as a symbol of the mysterious East, we strip her of what made her genuinely dangerous to her enemies, her sharp political intellect that no exotic charm could rival. Myths are worth more than they seem. Dismantling them isn't just an exercise in academic precision. It's a way to see the people of the past, and of the present, in their true complexity. Rome was not eternal. Egypt wasn't sealed off. The Maya have not disappeared. Caesar was not a tyrant in the eyes of those who loved him. Hatshepsut was not an anomaly. She was a ruler whose memory was attempted to be erased, but ultimately couldn't be. Tutankhamun was not great, yet his forgotten tomb became the most famous discovery in the history of archaeology. Norisov couldn't leave the USSR, yet he deciphered Maya script from photocopies in a snow-covered city thousands of kilometers away from the jungles where these inscriptions were made. Real history is the story of people who made the impossible possible, not because they were chosen by fate or raised by a she-wolf, but because they were stubborn, curious, dedicated to their cause, and sometimes simply found themselves in the right place with the right question. This is a far more compelling story than any myth. Supplement to the myth of Nero. Who really burned Rome? The question of who set fire to the eternal city remains unresolved to this day, and this uncertainty makes it particularly enticing for historians. In 1959, German historian Ludwig Hamann presented a well-argued version, suggesting that the culprits of the fire were never definitively identified. Tacitus, our main source, writes with caution, noting that some saw it as an accident, others as a conspiracy, without daring to draw a definitive conclusion. This reflects remarkable honesty for a historian who generally views Nero with skepticism. What we know is that the fire started in the commercial sections of the Great Circus, a place where accidental fires were quite likely. The summer heat, oil lamps, wooden structures, it created a perfect storm. Rome in the 1st century AD was a city with catastrophically poor fire safety, narrow streets, multi-story buildings, and a fire brigade consisting of only a few thousand people for a city of 1 million. As for the theory that Nero ordered the fire to clear space for a new palace complex, it has a fundamental weakness. The fire destroyed areas that were not part of any building plans. It was chaotic and uncontrollable. If this was indeed arson, the perpetrators had very little control over their actions. The Christians whom Nero blamed were likely scapegoats, not due to any real guilt, but because of their vulnerability. This small, unpopular, and misunderstood sect was the perfect target for public anger. This choice indicates political calculation, rather than an effort to identify the real culprits. Thus, even if we accept the idea of malicious intent, we have no grounds to believe that the intent belonged to Nero. All we have are indications that he used the tragedy for political purposes, just as countless rulers before and after him did. Adding to the myth of Hatshepsut, what did those who erased her name know? When scholars first discovered the systematic destruction of Hatshepsut's images and inscriptions, cartouches smashed, faces painted over, names replaced on the reliefs of her mortuary temple, initial reactions were confident. Thutmose III acted immediately after her death in a fit of personal outrage. Later studies corrected this view. An analysis of the timeline of the destruction, conducted by researchers from the Metropolitan Museum, who worked with materials from Deir el-Bahari, showed that the erasure of Hatshepsut's memory occurred not immediately after her death, but approximately 20 years later. By that time, Thutmose III was no longer a young man, having ruled successfully and independently for a long period. His power was secure. There was no practical threat from the memory of the deceased regent. So why did it happen? One of the explanations offered by researchers is that this was not an act of personal vengeance, but rather dynastic politics. Thutmose was preparing to pass power to his son, Amenhotep II, and he sought to create a clear line of succession, from himself through his father to his grandfather, bypassing the inconvenient episode of a female pharaoh. Her presence in the official records created a precedent that could complicate the legitimacy of the hereditary line. This does not make the act any less cruel towards the memory of Hatshepsut. However, it makes it more understandable as a historical phenomenon, not the madness of personal grievance, but the cold calculation of statecraft. Her name was erased not out of hatred, but perhaps out of enough respect to understand that her example spoke volumes. History sometimes wipes away those it fears might inspire repetition. Supplement to the myth of the Rosetta Stone. The fate of an object that changed history. When we talk about the Rosetta Stone, we usually focus on its decipherment and exclaim, "Here it is, the discovery." However, the story of the stone itself, a piece of dioritic gneiss measuring about 114 centimeters in height and 72 centimeters in width, is just as captivating as the inscription it bears. French troops discovered the stone in 1799 while building defensive fortifications near Rosetta. Officer Pierre-François Bouchard recognized the significance of the find and sent it to Cairo, to the Egyptian Institute established by Napoleon for the study of the country. Scholars immediately recognized the potential of the inscription and made copies. When British forces defeated the French in Egypt in 1801, the Rosetta Stone became one of the war trophies transferred to the British under the terms of the Alexandria Capitulation. French scholars resisted, claiming it as their discovery and scientific treasure. The British insisted. In 1802, the stone arrived in London and was placed in the British Museum, where it remains today. Egypt has repeatedly demanded its return. Debates over the restitution of cultural artifacts taken during the colonial era intensified in the 21st century, and the Rosetta Stone became a focal point of this discussion. The British Museum currently refuses to return it, citing its significance as a universal repository of world culture. Egyptians argue that the stone rightfully belongs to the country that is part of its history. An object that deciphered the language of the pharaohs has become a symbol of another unresolved historical issue. Who owns the past, and who has the right to preserve it? This is a question that the 30 myths in our series never fully answer, and perhaps rightly so. Some questions are more important precisely because they remain open. Supplement to the myth of the Book of the Dead, the most remarkable spell. Among the approximately 190 spells that scholars refer to as the Book of the Dead, there is one that stands out due to its unexpected humanity. This is spell 125, known as the Confession of Negation, or the Negative Confession. Before the judgment of Osiris, The soul of the deceased was to pronounce a list of wrongdoings they did not commit. I did not lie. I did not steal. I did not kill. I did not take what wasn't mine. I did not weep without cause. I did not ignore the words of truth. I did not mistreat the weak. The list includes over 40 statements, many of which pertain not only to criminal acts but also to everyday interpersonal and ethical violations. I did not harm servants in front of their masters. I did not cause tears. I did not act with arrogance. I did not turn away from the hungry. This is not a legal code or a bureaucratic list. It is an attempt to articulate what a dignified life means, through its denial, through what you did not do. Notably, many of these points concern not religious rituals or relationships with gods, but relationships among people, honesty, fairness, compassion. The Egyptian who spoke these words before the scales, where his heart was weighed against the feather of the goddess of justice, Ma'at, ultimately addressed the same truth that all ethical systems across civilizations convey, that a life lived is measured not just by what you built or conquered, but by how you treated those around you. 3,500 years separate us from the individuals who wrote these texts, yet this distance disappears when reading, I did not make others cry. Final thoughts. 3 civilizations and 1 lesson. Rome, Egypt, the Maya. 3 worlds divided by space and time, unified by one thing. Each created narratives about themselves that served specific purposes, legitimizing power, explaining the order of the world, preserving identity. Each left us enough traces to see the genuine life behind the official narratives. Rome bequeathed the idea of law and universal citizenship, yet continually violated it. Egypt left us an image of eternity, while being deeply intertwined with change, trade, political intrigue, and women pharaohs. The Maya gifted us the concept of zero, astronomical precision, and 8 million living heirs, yet they were labeled the vanished. All 30 myths explored in this series share a common thread. They emerged when someone, out of political calculation, aesthetic need, or simple ignorance, preferred a beautiful legend to a complex truth. They endure today because a beautiful story requires less effort than a complicated one. But complex truths are richer. They encompass workers who left jokes on the stones of the pyramids. They include a woman pharaoh, her name erased, but who nonetheless returned. They involve a linguist, deciphering a foreign letter from a photocopy in a strange city, driven by the desire to know. They embody 8 million people who did not vanish at all. Truth demands attention. It requires the willingness to let go of a comforting image for one that is uncomfortable but alive. It asks us to acknowledge that people of the past were as complex as we are today, and that is what makes their stories worth telling over and over again. 30 myths behind us, 30 living stories ahead.